everybody, this is Miss Nicole with Bloomfield Public Library, and I'm here with our latest edition of Science Bytes, and today we are going to talk about flight. And as we talk about flight, we're also going to show some really neat projects for how you can do some starter paper airplanes, and I'll give you guys some ideas about some resources that you might be able to reference to take it a little further. We won't have time to do all the paper airplanes that I want to do, but I handpicked a few different styles to get you started. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about flight. And there were some interesting things that I learned when I was diving into the subject matter. First of all, there are only 4 classes of life on our planet that have ever truly mastered flight on their own. And that is insects, and birds, and bats, and pterosaurs. And pterosaurs are a kind of extinct dinosaur. Insects are really the true masters because they have very specialized wings that they use for all of their flying. All of the other categories, birds, bats, and pterosaurs, all sort of evolved into flying creatures. Their arms or their hands evolved into something like wings, and feathers developed, but insects right from the get-go, from about 300 million years ago, had very specialized wings and are really nature's truest flyers. Another interesting thing to note is that just because you have wings doesn't mean you can necessarily glide. And gliding is when you sort of ride the air. You don't have to flap your wings, you can just ride the air. One example of a natural glider is a butterfly. And this explains how butterflies, like the monarch butterfly, for example, is able to migrate all the way from Canada down to Mexico. They could never make that entire flight using their own wings and flying the whole way. So what they do is they rest their wings and glide for a lot of the flight. And in the case of monarchs, they don't have a long lifespan either. So it takes multiple generations of monarch butterflies to get all the way down to Mexico. But that's a story for another video. But for today's purposes, we're going to talk about flight in terms of airplanes in particular. And here I have an example of a paper airplane I made. And we are going to make this airplane, and it's actually called, I wrote the name on the back, the belly button in the book I was doing. So we are going to learn how to make this one. But there are certain things you want to understand about flight before we get into our discussion about the paper airplanes. One of those things is lift, the concept of lift. And lift is how air is going to keep our airplane up aloft in the air and not on the ground. So you may remember from when we talked about the Bernoulli principle that when we have a fast stream of air, there's an area of low pressure surrounding that fast stream of air. So as the air hits our plane, we have this fast stream of air that's going across the top of our plane, which is creating also this area of lower pressure. So the air that's pushing up from under the plane is actually stronger than the pressure, and is a higher pressure than the pressure on top of the plane. And that's why we get the lift, okay? Something you also want to understand is thrust. And thrust is what's going to push our airplane through the air. And in our case, with a paper airplane anyways, thrust might be our hands and the power we use in our arm to move that plane through the air. Another type of thrust, we might use some rubber bands to shoot some planes through the air or some rockets through the air. So that's another example of thrust. So thrust is what's moving our object through the air. We also have something called drag. And drag is what slows up the plane's progress through the air. So eventually, our plane is not going to fly through the air for infinity. Eventually, air is going to push back on our plane enough that it slows its speed, and then eventually it's going to come down to the earth. And that's drag. Drag is what's slowing up the progress of our plane. And then, of course, the last force that we're going to be dealing with today is gravity. And as most of us know, gravity is that force that's pulling things down towards the earth. And that is impacted by how heavy an object might be. But it's always present. It's always there pulling on our plane. But it also has a very important role. And what gravity does for us that none of the other forces do, it provides balance. So without gravity, the lift that we put onto our plane and the thrust and the lift, all those might have our plane going straight up into the sky. But we want our plane to be going nice and smoothly across. Gravity helps to balance that. So instead of our plane just going up into the atmosphere, we have gravity helping to keep our plane balanced in the air and at an even pace and at an even flow. So gravity has a very important role here. So now I'm actually going to show you some really cool examples of some projects to get you started. You don't need any special supplies. I used things like tape, scissors. I have a ruler to help me launch some things, some rubber bands, some straws. But if you don't have any of those things around, you just need a piece of regular copy paper. I have paper here that's colored, but it's just like regular copy paper. And there are actually some really great resources. I decided to use our online digital resource called Hoopla, where you can borrow books and movies and music. And I actually scanned to see what they had digitally for paper airplane books. I actually found 2 books on Hoopla that I really liked. They were my favorites. I downloaded several, but these were the 2 that were my favorites. One of the books is called Ultimate Paper Airplanes for Kids by Andrew Dewar. The other book I liked, actually, I borrowed via EBSCO. It's like a downloadable ebook. If you went to our library catalog, you could click on the link and it would take you right to where the electronic version of the book is. And this is also one of my old favorites. This is called The Flying Machine Book by Bobby Mercer. And in this book, the pictures aren't always the greatest. They're kind of black and white and a little bit grainy, but there's such a wide variety of projects that I love this book. There's some really cool, neat, very different versions of flying machines. So those are my 2 favorites. They were my 2 picks for today. in creating the paper airplane is really only half the battle. That's only half the project. They're usually not very complicated folding projects. It is sort of like a form of origami, so you're going to need to make sure that you're folding with nice, crisp lines and making sure that everything is even. But with paper airplanes, part of it is how you make adjustments once you've created your paper airplane. So here I have one I finished, and if we look at it from this angle, you can see that it's pretty straight. These wings are pretty straight across. Now, if I throw this paper airplane and I see that all of a sudden it's flying off to the side, or I see that it takes a quick dive and it doesn't go very far straight ahead, that's when you need to make tiny adjustments. So if you notice that it seems to be flying off in a curve to the right, then you probably need to just bend up the opposite wing just a little bit to try and help even it out. If it seems to be taking a big dive, one thing you can do is fold up the backs of both planes. Not really a fold, it's more like you're gently curving it up a little bit. And that helps it fly a little straighter. Instead of going down, it's going to help it go up a little more. Now, the way I folded this right now, odds are that this plane would just go straight up, which is not exactly what we want. But these are the kind of things you need to do when you first do a paper airplane. So if you do a paper airplane and it is not flying the way you want, do not throw it away. Try and make these tiny tweaks and adjustments to see if you can get it to fly well. And the first step is to see if you can get it as straight as possible and to throw it nice and even and straight. That's going to be your first test. And then you make the tiny tweaks. And when you practice enough, you might be able to fold something like this. This is a recreation of a real-world Air Force plane done by our library page, Demoy Wright. Well, that's all we have time for with this episode of Science Bytes. But again, be sure to check out our electronic resources for some great books with tons of paper airplane projects. Or we also have paper airplane books at the library, so you can feel free to call our curbside service and borrow those. This is the perfect time to be doing paper airplanes because you can do it inside or outside. As long as it's not too windy of a day. Big winds do not make for good paper airplane throws. But it's a great thing to do outside. It's also a great thing to do inside if you want to stay cool with the air conditioner. But hopefully you will try out some of these projects. They're super fun. If for some reason you don't have a lot of good paper at home, give us a call about that too, and just ask to talk to Miss Nicole, and I'll see if I can put in some nice paper for you in a curbside pickup. Until next time, bye everybody.